there were three things that I discovered about the earliest feminism that were really there from the very first maybe 2 decades. One of them is this idea of restructuring society, which of course has become this idea of smashing the patriarchy. The second one is free love and this getting rid of monogamy, getting rid of the family, allowing women to have kind of these laissez-faire relationships. And then the third one is the occult, and the occult was very involved from almost the very beginning. Certainly we see that with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was basically made herself the grandmother of feminism in the United States.
Hello and welcome back to HLI Ireland's Let's Talk. This is the weekly show that looks at all things life, faith and family through a Catholic lens. I am your host, Lisa O'Hare, and we are still delving into our summer topic of the dignity of women. Now, in today's episode, we will be discussing the whole area of toxic femininity. Have you ever heard of the Auntie Mary spirit? This is something that you're really going to be keen to listen to, and I am delighted, honoured and actually surprised that I have a very top guest here today. We have Carrie Gress, who is the author of The Auntie Mary Exposed, this book that we'll be discussing today, Rescuing the Culture from Toxic Femininity. Carrie is a fellow at the Washington, D.C. based think tank Ethics and Public Policy Centre. She's a scholar at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University. She's a doctorate in philosophy. So she is a philosopher, entrepreneur, a prolific writer. She has many more books, some of which are coming up. There's a new book coming up at the end of August. So we're going to talk about that as well. She's also a homeschooling mother of 5. Carrie, you're so welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you. I think this is the first podcast I've done in Ireland. So this is great.
Great. So we're introducing you to an Irish audience. Well, I know your book, The Marian Option, was very popular here in Ireland. So this is the follow-on book, or one of many that you've written. And I wanted just to, because of our theme, the dignity of women, this book of yours just really nails it, what we're looking at, and looking at the culture of toxic femininity. Can you maybe first of all define that theme, toxic femininity, and maybe give us a little bit about your motivations for writing this book?
Sure. Yeah. So the book really came about when I was writing the Marian Option, actually, because I was looking, it was during the election. I was doing the research election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And I just realized that if Hillary Clinton had been elected, she would have been the most powerful woman in the world. And that was a title actually that National Geographic had given to Our Lady in an article that they had published years prior. And I thought, for her to be the most powerful woman in the world, she's diametrically opposed to all of the values that Our Lady stands for. And it just really got me thinking about not just her, but also the other elite women that really dictate what women think about themselves in our culture. And so that really got me started on thinking, like, these women aren't just slightly away from Our Lady's virtues, but they actually embody the vices of the world. Certainly on the issue of life and abortion is the big one, but there's so many other areas in which that women are being denigrated and not valued for who they are. So that was really where the idea came from. And then it just, I thought when I started to write the book, I was worried that I wouldn't have enough data or information on, to really make my point well. And of course, there was so much, once I started paying attention to it. So toxic femininity really is this idea that women have espoused really over the last 200 years. It's been a very gradual progression, but we can see it in this sense of women having this belief that they are victims and that they're minorities and that they deserve special treatment. We can see it, in that idea of believe all women and just taking on everything that women say, whether, without even actually verifying that women are telling the truth. But what it has created is this kind of narcissism in women where we're very focused on ourselves, on our needs, our desires, our capacity to emote and to let everybody know what we're thinking. But also it shuts us off from a kind of service that is really fundamental to what it means to be a woman and serving the needs of others. So it takes toxic femininity is really just this inversion of woman and bringing out the worst of woman versus those virtues that we know are so important in terms of serving the world and our families and the culture and civilization. So that's really the idea behind it. But the concept of the anti-Mary was actually brand new. My publisher and I had to figure out, how do we even spell it? Does it have a hyphen in it? What gets capitalized? Because it was just a brand new idea. So, but it mimics that notion of the Antichrist. I know in one of John's letters in Scripture, he talks about a spirit of the Antichrist entering into the world. And it's that kind of generic spirit. It's not like there's one person that we point to and say, she's the anti-Mary. I think we could think of people that might fill that bill, but the book talks about it more generally and how the entirety of Western civilization has been infected by this.
Yeah, and I think, you really honed in on it when you talked about the marks of anti-Mary. So this is just for page 10, if anyone's going to go out and get the book. The marks of the anti-Mary being rage, indignation, vulgarity, and pride, and a sort of short-circuiting women's greatest gifts of wisdom and prudence and patience and unflappable peace and intuition. And you talked about women sort of using their vices in this culture instead of their virtues in order to get what they want.
Yeah. So a lot of manipulation, a lot of control, a lot of power. And that's really at the heart of it. We see that certainly in the culture is this idea of trying to be in control of everything. And that, as we know, is really becomes a vice when you're using these means to control people for your own purposes.
Yeah. And there's a thread through it as well, which devalues motherhood. Mm-hmm. I know that you are you're a contributor in theology of the home. So obviously, like, the theology of the home is so rich and so important, and our role as wife and mother is like so important in the kingdom. But yet, those are the very values and the very identities that this whole secular culture is targeting.
Yeah. And that's actually, I explore this a lot more in my new book that's coming out in August, The End of Woman. And I go back to the very beginning. It's almost a prequel to the anti-Mary in a lot of respects, because I go back to the very earliest roots of feminism. And one of the things that became abundantly clear to me is that feminism was trying to answer the question of how do we help women? But the way that they were answering it was by making women more like men. And that's been the whole trajectory. And then we can even see, we can talk later more about how this affects the trans culture and why that's become so animated and so alive. But it's really just an extension of what feminism has already started. And this idea that women and even motherhood is somehow not connected to womanhood. But also this idea that we've been told, being a man is really the highest and the best way in which we can live our lives. And that's what we've been told largely for the last 50 years as women in Western cultures. And so it shouldn't surprise us at all that motherhood is so denigrated, and, abortion is obviously the tool through which they help women become like men by getting rid of their children altogether. So there's a real pattern there. And it's been a huge problem, and it truly has been the most deadly ideology in the world's ever seen when you look at the abortion numbers, because of this lie that we've been told that we should abort our children, or certainly use as well as using contraception. Those are the two tools that have biologically allowed us to mimic men in this way that they're telling us we should.
Yeah, it's crazy. And as you said, we touched about this, in a previous theme when we were looking at the whole trans ideology. And our contributor, James Parker, at the time said that, that this isn't a new phenomenon. The seeds of this have been sown for the past number of generations. And so, what you're saying there is it's the same with femininity. And I think you went into it in the book when you talked about the goddess worship, these archetypes. Is that sort of something that links back, or would you say these are kind of seeds that have been resown?
Yeah. So there were three things that I discovered about the earliest feminism that were really there from the very first maybe two decades. One of them is this idea of restructuring society, which of course has become this idea of smashing the patriarchy. The second one is free love and this getting rid of monogamy, getting rid of the family, allowing women to have kind of these laissez-faire relationships. And then the third one is the occult, and the occult was very involved from almost the very beginning. Certainly, we see that with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was basically made herself the grandmother of feminism in the United States. And she was very involved with mediums and seances and all these different, connections with the spirit to try and tell her what to do and kind of give her ideas. So that was something that was very much a part of her work in early feminism. And she was actually very anti-Christian. She was involved with this kind of new age religion called Theosophy. You can see this in her book. She wrote this book with a number of other women called The Women's Bible, where she makes commentary on all these parts of scripture. And it's actually kind of comical to read. I mean, it's tragic that it was actually published and still, you can still buy it, because it's sort of like a teenager just reading through scripture and getting, having an emotional rant about anytime a woman is in scripture, the way she's treated. And anyway, it's amusing, aside from the fact that it's also so sad that this was the woman that has influenced so many feminists in the world. The occult has absolutely been a part of it. And then there was also a connection with communism back in the early 1900s that developed. Initially, the communists and the feminists didn't agree at all. And it was a big rift between them, and then they realized they had kind of common purposes, and so that's when they started working together more in the 1930s and 40s. And we can see this culmination in Betty Friedan's work. And Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. It sold 3 million copies, and her whole argument was really focused on this idea that women can't be happy if they're at home. And she said that the home is a comfortable concentration camp, which of course, sounds just incredible to think about. These women that she's describing, who are all of her classmates. She said she interviewed a bunch of her classmates from college, and they were all just as discontented with home life as she was. And they're in these, at that point, the most wealthy culture, the most wealthy culture in all of history. And for her to compare it to a concentration camp is, of course, mind-blowing. But her whole point was that she firmly believed in the Marxist idea that women would not be happy unless they were working. That whole idea of Arbeit macht frei that we see at the gates of Auschwitz, work will make you set you free. So that's what she was pushing for. And she used a lot of psychological tricks and tools to convince women that they would be happier if they left home. There's definitely been a concerted element, and with the thread, and certainly communism is part of that, and its atheistic agenda as well. So it's been amazing to see just how deep the occult element has played a role in the whole movement.
Yeah. And I think, you have a clinker line in it as well, because I don't know whether we are at the end of this whole phenomenon, because obviously women have got absolutely everything they want, and to the point where there's like the reverse discrimination, where women are getting all these positions and getting more than they even deserve in many situations. But the line that you had, page 11, folks, if you want to get the book, is women aren't getting happier, they're just getting more medicated. I think that's a pretty telling sign of where we are in terms of the happiness gauge.
Yeah. And that's the thing that over and over again, you would think that if feminism was really working, women would be getting happier, but we aren't seeing that. We're seeing depression levels are, through the roof, suicide, STDs, divorce, all of those kinds of indicators that tell us where women are at and their level of happiness. And we're just not seeing it. And so that's the real tragedy in all of this, is that's the data that's also being hidden from women. We're just being told and continually pushed towards more of this without realizing the push is happening because we are much easier to control when we're not in a family, when we're depressed, we're alone, we don't have anyone to support us, not only on a government level, because we're more dependent on the government that way, which is part of the idea, but also spiritually. How much easier is it for Satan to get into our souls and, make us feel regret and awful, and all those ways in which he manipulates us when we're by ourselves and when we're feeling completely isolated from connected family, especially later on in our life when we get to that point where we are too old to have children, or family members are dying out, all of that. So you can really see the diabolical purposes playing out on both a natural and a supernatural level.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, now, I mean, we've done a very good diagnosis of the situation, and it is quite depressing, but I think it has to be acknowledged. But now I want to move to the second half of your book, which is that Our Lady Mary is the antidote to all this. Can you maybe explain a little bit about that and really fill our souls with what is within our grasp and the beautiful model of womanhood that we have and we should be striving for?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the exciting thing is to just recognize that women really are made to be mothers. I know in the United States, I take great hope in what I'm seeing in this pet craze that has happened here, where, there's fur babies, and women call themselves, paw parents, and all of that. We see bumper stickers that say, I love my grand dog, things like that. But in a certain respect, it's gotten ridiculous. I mean, as Americans, we spend $700 million on costumes for Halloween for pets. And that number just keeps going up. But when I first started tracking this number, it was 500 million. And now we're up to $700 million for pet costumes. But I think the exciting thing is it's just this recognition that we are made to mother others. And that's, the beauty of the Blessed Mother. She's the Virgin Mother. And this is what the left has been targeting, as well as this idea of virginity and motherhood. There's a woman who used to write for Cosmopolitan magazine who had this big conversion. Sue Ellen Browder is her name. And she talks about how when she wrote for Cosmopolitan, she could make up all these stories, but the women could not be virgins or mothers in the stories. They could do anything else they wanted, but they couldn't be virgins or mothers. And that's precisely because these are the ways in which God sanctifies us and makes us holy. These are the ways in which, we live our faith as Catholic women. So that is, I think, a very encouraging thing to see, that she's the model that they're really trying to bring down. If you vacate motherhood in the world, then it's very hard for people to even understand the Blessed Mother. And that's really what we've been seeing. So of course she becomes the antidote. She's the one that really we need to start, tethering our thoughts to and start our prayers to. I mean, this is the beauty of the rosary, is so much happens when we're praying the rosary without us even realizing the way that she's mothering us and coming to us. But yeah, I think that the hard part about it is that we oftentimes can think of her in very saccharine or remote terms, especially if we haven't had a good mother to model for us motherhood. It's very hard to wrap our minds around that, or even emotionally feel connected to her. So I think that's the big challenge. And that was one of the things I really wanted to do in this book, was just show these ways in which our lives and her lives are very similar. And it's funny because I think there's 2 or 3 different ways I point out. One of them is that she's certainly a daughter of God the Father. She's loved. A second way is that she's doing good. She's always doing the will of God. So she's always creating something good. And then the third thing is just her beauty. That was one of the things that was most interesting when I was researching the Marian option, was that whenever there was somebody that had an apparition of Our Lady, that was always, one of the first 2 things that they said. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. There's a great quote by Saint Therese of Lisieux, who said, she was so beautiful that you would want to die just so you could see her again. So that part was really important. And, actually, after I wrote this book, ironically, I was with my daughters in a hotel room, and there's this channel called Hallmark Channel here in the US. I suspect you guys have the Hallmark Channel as well. But these movies are cookie cutter. They always feature a woman who, she goes back to her hometown. She's had some sort of crisis in her career, and she goes back to her hometown to, save a library or something. And she falls in love with the boy she grew up with next door. And she looks gorgeous while she's doing it, but it was funny because I realized the Hallmark has figured out the formula of the desire of a woman's heart. And these are all the things that Our Lady is, this Hallmark formula of she's loved by a man, and she's doing something good, and she's beautiful. Those kind of elements are really what the longing of our heart is. to do, and Our Lady offers us that model, but not obviously in this saccharine Hallmark fashion. But that's what's interesting to me, is how popular and successful Hallmark has become because of this recipe, that I think really offers for all of us, points back to a deeper way in which we can understand ourselves as daughters of God the Father, something much, much, much deeper than what Hallmark can ever offer, much more beautiful, because these aren't things that are just coming from us, but they're coming from God when we're really praying with him, when Mary is our mother. We're doing things on a kind of a supernatural level, and not just this natural level like we're seeing in a Hallmark film. So I think that those are really important elements that we need to recognize and not belittle, or not abuse, which, we can see that kind of abuse in the beauty world. Mary is beautiful to point to God's beauty. Women are made beautifully for that same reason as well, not to be manipulating others or not for vanity's sake. So it's important to parse those things out and see them in the right context. But I think those are vital elements of womanhood.
Yeah, I think there's so much, like you say, and the Rosary helps to do that, to contemplate Our Lady, contemplate her life, contemplate the reality of her life, the early days of the workings of God in her, and the miraculous, incarnation of Christ, but then obviously the suffering as well that she went through. And that's something that our culture just wants to eradicate. I've said it before in many episodes. It just wants to press the delete button to a life that's inconvenient, or to any kind of a suffering. Huge pushes for euthanasia. But I think one of the beautiful themes also that really is captured in this section is the theme of fruitfulness. Yeah. Both physical and spiritual fruitfulness. And you talk about, anything that you give a woman, she'll make it greater. Can you elaborate a wee bit on that? I thought that was a really beautiful way to look at womanhood.
Yeah, it's a quote that I will not be able to quote off the top of my head, but it really is this idea that, if you give a woman groceries, she'll make you an amazing meal. Just that gift of hospitality. If you entrust that the marital embrace brings about children, this isn't just something that's sterile, that there's something that fruitful and good that comes from it. And I think this is really the beauty of woman, is that we can take very simple things. I'm sure you probably know women in your life that they may not have a lot of material wealth, but they can take the smallest things and suddenly it's either a beautiful meal or a beautiful room or a beautiful picnic, that kind of creativity and ingenuity. So I think that is a crucial element. And, a lot of this really comes back to this idea of mothering and motherhood as well, which has become very taboo kind of language. But that's really what it means, is to shelter and protect and provide for others in a way that they can then become who God made them to be, instead of blocking that or inhibiting that. And I think that is a helpful way to start looking at what fruitfulness is really kind of opening doors, or, it's almost, gardening is a great example of this, pulling out the weeds and tending to something, making sure the soil is right, all of those things. And this is what women just kind of do instinctively in their homes, largely because our body is a home, biologically when we have children. So all of these things extend out both psychologically, but also spiritually. And I think we can see the beauty of that in the spiritual motherhood of female religious, which is another area that has really taken a hit because of the anti-Marian culture, and that denigration of what religious nuns do, because it looks like they don't really do anything in our culture that values so much busyness. Yeah. So there's really a lot that we have to chew on, particularly as Catholics, because we have all these amazing saint women, to really show us kind of this archetype, and obviously in addition to who Our Lady is as well.
And it's fundamental then to culture. I'm sure that's sort of, what you maybe look at in your next book, but you quoted Archbishop Fulton Sheen, and I'm sure many of our viewers will be familiar with the quote: "When a man loves a woman, it follows that the nobler the woman, the nobler the love. The higher the demands made by the woman, the more worthy a man must be. And that's why woman is the measure of the level of our civilization." And we can't underestimate our power, because the ironic thing is that the feminists want power, but they don't understand that we have that power, like within us, within our bodies, in our dignity as children of God, but also within our womanhood and our relationship to children, to the next generation. And it's just ironic that they kind of misinterpret what power is and manipulate this sort of, like you say, that the vices and not the beauty of the power that we do. And you can see that in your own motherhood. I'm sure, you know, as a homeschool mum, you can see the influence that you have on your children and the power that God's given us to mold hearts and minds. And it's a huge part of this whole battle to rescue the culture, is to mold the hearts and minds of the next generation through their parents.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And I think, you know, there's this amazing tension too, because we've been told as women, you know, we sort of need to become like men, but not even good men, you know, not even the virtues that men embody, but it's more like the worst of men. And so it's this strange struggle that they've created in women is, you know, I want to be just like you, but I also hate you. I hate, you know, the toxic masculinity that they're describing, which is slightly different than the way I use toxic femininity. But it's this tension of that's there, that men need to change and become more like women, even though we want to be just like men. So that's the really remarkable thing, is just what a disservice we've done to ourselves, because it really ultimately does, like I said, weaken us and make us incredibly vulnerable on all these different levels that we can't anticipate, because we're just so caught up in the fashion of it and the sensibility of it, and really the kind of control that's been exerted on us by it. I think of which, you know, most of us are scarcely aware of how really indoctrinated we have been by the movement over these last 50 years.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, we sort of ended the first section looking at the culture by talking about how unhappy it has made women, and how much they've relied on medication, and how, you know, all the indicator signs of unhappiness. But there's such a fulfillment by imitating Mary and by following the design that God has for life and for family and for motherhood and for, you know, our fruitfulness. That's where, you know, we are truly fulfilled.
Yeah. And I think that that's a great point too, is that you know, the culture tells us that our fulfillment will be in a career, or, you know, but being a girl boss, or, you know, whatever they're telling us to do. None of these things will fulfill us, because they're not naturally made to fulfill us. And of course, even just being married doesn't do that. You know, our spouse isn't made to fulfill us. God is meant to fulfill us. So that ultimate emptiness that we're we're trying to fill, they can keep kind of moving the goalposts, because it's not doing what they tell us it's doing. It will only be through God and that living out of our vocation, but also really understanding that role of suffering and a self-gift that comes with it. But I think too, we've also really lost a sense of joy, the joy that comes in living our vocation and struggling and suffering through things, but seeing the fruit that comes out on the other side of it. You know, birth is obviously, giving birth to a child is probably a perfect example of that, that kind of pain with a purpose. But our lives, you know, that pain with a purpose doesn't just happen on the day the child is born. It happens throughout our life, and it, you know, becomes beautiful as you raise these children, and ultimately they become friends, you know, later in life, because the fact that you've, you know, tended this child to that stage. So anyway, yeah, I think all of those things we don't talk about enough, because they feel like they've become very taboo, or some just, you know, out of fashion. And I think that that's something that women are finally realizing, like, maybe there's more here than we've been paying attention to. Maybe there's not anything wrong with all of these things that women love to do at home. And that's why we're seeing this real explosion in popularity and you know, a lot of the home areas of, you know, home hobbies, like crocheting, knitting, gardening, sourdough bread, you know, all of that. So we're embracing a lot of the crafts of the home, but it's still, that word homemaker feels very taboo. So I think it's just a matter of time before people really start saying, like, what are we missing here? And I think people are open to it now in ways that they weren't maybe even 10 years ago.
Is there anything, just because we're going to wrap up here now, is there anything you would say to women who maybe feel cheated, or that, you know, you sort of alluded to it before, they've got to their end of their lives and they're realizing it's too late to have children, and that they have been somehow duped or lied to, and, you know, lost out on those fertility years? Is there anything that you could say to women now, in terms of encouragement for what lies ahead?
It's a golden opportunity, because they're the women that I hear from a lot, and they have the opportunity to tell other women, don't go down this road that I have gone down. But they never lost who they were as that vocation of mothering others. And that can express itself in different ways, but I think that God obviously still has a plan for them, and still wants to use their gifts and grow them, and even knit them into a community in certain ways as well. So I think that those are all important things that, when you're connected with God and the faith, there's going to be incredible opportunities and joy and abundance in what he's going to provide. So nothing is beyond him. He obviously can draw straight with crooked lines. But yeah, I think it comes down to a question of vocation. I know many women who are now, rather than being driven by the bitterness that they feel, they've turned that around and said, look, I've got to do something positive with this, and tell women, don't follow in these footsteps. This is not the place where it is that you want to go. And I think ultimately help other women avoid those traps is that feminism is really providing.
Yeah. I mean, I always would like to end our episodes on that hope, and for no matter where, because we don't know where our listeners are, where you're at, viewers, in terms of this whole story, because we've all been wrapped up on it, particularly women of our generation, but maybe even older and ones coming up. There's been so many pitfalls, and it's been such a deluge of information and brainwashing. But I mean, to quote Edith Stein, you said that in your book, you quoted her, women fulfill themselves by giving something of their own life so that others may have life, so that others may live. And I think that's still an opportunity for all of us, that despite where you are in your childbearing years, we have the opportunity to give something of ourselves to bring life. And it's the antidote, it's the absolute opposite to this culture of death. And it's both spiritual, it's physical, it's practical, it's, there's so many ways that we can bring life to counteract this culture of death, because that unhappiness is out there and we need to do something about it. And like you say, we need to use those voices of people who've been through it. And we need to encourage the younger generation to refute these lies and to really strive for the deep happiness, the lasting joy that comes with being a follower of Christ and imitating Our Lady and her beauty and her fruitfulness and all of that. Carrie, it's been so interesting. So tell us a little bit about the book that's coming out in August then, just before we wrap up.
Yeah, so the new book, the End of Woman, is really just looking at how it is that we've gotten to this point where we can't really define what a woman is. How do we get here? What was the path? And ultimately to this idea that somehow women need to not be women anymore and can use biology to change themselves into men, which of course we know is an impossibility. So that's really the book. It's a secular book, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how it's received. I've already gotten a lot of incredible feedback from it, because I think people are asking this question and wanting to know how we got to this point and how do we move back to something healthy and solid and beautiful again. So that's really what I think the book is aiming to do.
Brilliant. Look forward to that. That's only next month. Gosh, I'm thinking August is months.
I know it's
Sorry. Yeah. I'm lost in the time warp here. But that's brilliant. I really look forward to that, because it follows and it ties in with some of the themes that we've been discussing over the last year, on the transgenderism issues. And, we followed into marriage, and now we're into womanhood. And next month, we'll be talking about men's issues and the dignity and the higher calling of man as well. So you can watch this space. So Carrie, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and we will look out for that new book, and maybe next year we'll get you on again and you can tell us about the new book and how it's gone down. God bless you and your family as well in the meantime.
Thank you. Likewise.
So thank you everyone for spending time with us today. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Drop us some comments, get the algorithms going. We really want your support to spread the good news that we have. And remember that we at HLI Ireland are working and praying for an Ireland where God is first, life is sacred, and the family is cherished. Until next time, God bless.